last year was our centenary year. And for the last 100 years, we have been proudly at the forefront of exploring mental health and well-being, from attachment theory and infant observation to applying psychoanalytic and systemic approaches in varied settings. Our ideas have led to changes in care, education, and beyond. And our centenary festival that we're now coming to the end of is celebrating our history and exploring contemporary issues in relation to identity, relationships, and society. And for those of you who don't know the Tavistock, we are both an NHS mental health clinic, where social workers form part of many of our clinical services. And we're also a centre of education and training. And in that, we have a social work qualifying master's degree and a doctorate in social work. So I just want to introduce the panel this morning. So Irene Henderson has worked at the Trust for many years. And for the last 4 years, Irene has been our Race and Diversity Champion, which is a trust-wide equalities lead role. Steve Bambrough is our Associate Clinical Director in the Children, Young People and Families Directorate. He's also been a social worker since 1995 and has worked in a variety of child protection and mental health settings. And I'm delighted to welcome Wayne Reid, who is one of the professional officers and a social worker and anti-racism visionary for the British Association of Social Work England. Wayne qualified as a social worker in 2010, but the entirety of his social care experience spans almost 20 years, working in fostering, probation service, youth offending, adult mental health, child protection, and with young people in care. Wayne is also a contributor to a very newly published anthology called Outlanders, Hidden Narratives from Social Workers of Colour. And I'd also like to introduce Ghazal Tipu, who is our Senior Communications Officer, and Ghazal has been instrumental in organising today's event and will be working behind the scenes to make sure the event goes smoothly. So just to welcome her and thank her for her work in making today happen. So I'm just going to say a little bit about the format of this morning. So Steve, Irene and myself will all give a brief perspective on what's going on in the Trust from our different roles, and give some context about how we're working around issues of race, race equality and racism here at the Tavistock. We will then hand over to Wayne, who will be speaking for about 45 minutes, and he has a presentation that he'll be going through. Just to say that the slides from his presentation will be available to you after today's event. We will take a very brief comfort break at about 11 o'clock, and we will return 5 minutes later, and there'll be an opportunity for questions to the panel, and also we hope very much a lively discussion. So I'm just going to say a few words before I hand over to my colleagues at the Trust. So we all know what a difficult year 2020 has been, and very difficult for many people. And it's also a year in which racial inequality has been highlighted across both sides of the Atlantic, with George Floyd's murder and also COVID with its disproportionate impact on Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities. And the outrage this evoked and the Black Lives Matter protests in the UK and beyond seem to garner a collective wide-ranging response from individuals and organisations alike. And in June last year, the top 5 books in Waterstone's bestsellers chart were Bernardine Evaristo's Booker Prize winning Girl, Woman, Other, which was #1, and the following 4 books were all books about anti-racism. So within our Trust, these external events also happen to coincide with the Trust's race equality strategy of 2017 to 2020 coming to an end, without many of its aims and ambitions being realised. And there was dissatisfaction and discontent about the experience of many of our Black, Asian and minority ethnic staff, and the lack of progress within the Trust. And this resulted in some of our staff in our race equality network and within the social work discipline, challenging the Trust's board of directors to take more effective action. And the result of this is that we have now formed a race equality steering group that Irene, Steve and myself are all a part of, An external review looking into trust culture around race has also been commissioned, and which will be being implemented shortly. And there has been a commitment at board level to the trust becoming an anti-racist organisation. We're certainly not sitting here today saying that we've achieved this by any means, and we know that we've still got a long, long way to go. But inviting Wayne to share his thoughts and speak to us today is part of helping us think together about how we continue to work to tackle the systemic institutionalized racism that's part of the NHS and part of our trust, and to create effective and enduring change. So within the Directorate of Education and Training, we're also aware that apart from our social work courses, we don't attract as many students from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds as we would like. And our data also tell us that, like much of the higher education sector, our Black, Asian and minority ethnic students are less likely to get a distinction or a merit compared to white students. And some of our Black, Asian and minority ethnic students tell us that they don't always feel supported, welcome or valued, so we still have much work to do. So some of the developments that we're putting in place in education and training are developing a training course on race equality, which will be provided to all staff within the Directorate. We have implemented the production of annual equality action plans, and these identify changes that are being made across courses and portfolios to address inequality, including things like diversifying and decolonising curricula, making our recruitment, teaching and assessment more inclusive, and building on our existing bursary schemes to support students from Black, Asian, minority ethnic backgrounds and disadvantaged backgrounds. And we're also developing a CPD course for social workers on becoming an anti-racist practitioner, an invitation to allyship, which we will be starting to deliver soon. So I'm going to hand over to Irene, who's going to talk about things from a wider trust level perspective.
Hello, everybody. Thanks, Paul. As Paul mentioned, the Trust is embarking on a journey which we hope will result in our organisation becoming an anti-racist and more inclusive employer. I'm pleased that we as a Trust are trying to navigate a path away from this institutionalised issue and give all staff better experiences at work. And I really welcome an event like this one today. I think it's important that our staff groups are representative of the population of patients and students that use our services. And the NHS prides itself on being a caring organisation, and we really do need to care about this. Talking specifically about staff, we've introduced many ways in which they are able to raise concerns, including in relation to racism at work, overt or otherwise. I think it's right and vital that we've provided these spaces, but it really is just a first step. The Trust now has the 5 staff and student networks. All of these avenues provide staff and students with specific networks to enable discussion and peer support. We are aware that intersectionality means many staff may feel they fit into several of the networks, which is not a problem. It's just refreshing that we have options for staff to attend some or all of the appropriate forums they may wish to attend. The LGBTQI+ was our first staff network, which was established in 2014. It is open to all Trust staff and has a strong, committed membership. This network provides a safe space for this group to meet and work together to push for equity in all areas of their working lives. The Race Equality Network has a membership of 101 staff from Black, Asian and ethnic minority backgrounds and was established in 2017. I'm the chair of this network and we meet once a month for an hour over the lunch break, and it's always an extremely lively, vibrant, innovative and thoughtful session. We also have the Allies group, and they work to promote equality in the Trust, but also work to support the Race Equality Network. It's open to all staff regardless of ethnicity who actively want to help the Trust on this anti-racist journey. This network was only formed in 2020 and already has 88 members. We have the Bane Student Network, which is a forum for all students from Black, Asian and ethnic minority backgrounds and has been going for some years. This is an opportunity for these students to meet on a monthly basis with fellow students to work through the many challenges faced during their studies at the Trust. The Disability and Long-Term Health Condition Network is our youngest network, which was only established this year, with the first meeting taking place in February. We already have a membership of 20, and I'm sure this will grow as news of the network reaches more staff. So it does feel like we have the appetite for change among many staff who've all demonstrated their commitment to greater equality by their work within these networks. I've been the race and diversity champion for the last 4 years, which has given me the opportunity to hear first-hand accounts of staff's experiences of being discriminated against at work. And very often this is for racial reasons. It is really difficult for staff to keep telling, reliving these negative experiences, and it is also often very difficult to hear them. But we have to listen, and we have to believe the lived experiences of our staff, students, and patients in order to be able to provide the best care and education. It's not easy to speak up in an organisation if you feel you suffered racial discrimination. But once staff have been brave enough to speak out, it's our duty to not only listen, but to act appropriately. And to do that, we need to have adequate processes in place. We need to effectively investigate and ensure the member of staff is supported and protected so they are not further disadvantaged just for speaking out. So as an entire staff group, we are tasked to work together to resolve this issue. And part of that has to be ensuring we are fully aware of how we treat each other. We need to be very curious about how our language and behaviour impacts those on the receiving end. And it's no longer acceptable to be unconsciously mildly offensive in our use of language for any staff group. So the Trust, like most organisations and society in general, definitely has a long way to go, but I'm sure events like this today will help to open and extend the debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene. And Steve Bambrough is now going to say a few words from a clinical perspective. Thanks, Steve.
What I'd like to say is that the time for complacency in the face of racism is over. Offering critique in a contemplative mode is over. The British state is ramping up the hostile environment, which I'm sure you all know about. That is a striking example of the institutional racism within the country. And an example of that, which I'm sure you also know about, is the Windrush scandal, in which hundreds of long-standing British citizens, British residents, were and continue to be harassed, deported, detained, discriminated against, illegally persecuted and expelled on the basis that they were illegal, that they were suddenly deemed unable to call this country their home. But the hostile environment isn't new. It's merely a continuation of a state practice that injures, weathers, incarcerates, and regularly delivers death in state custody. And my view is that these are atrocities of the state against Black peoples. Now, there's an urgency coming from the street, and we need to find ways of being of service to this movement. And that's as social workers, but as people too. As social workers, as people, citizens, we need to actively engage in the struggle. And if we can't be actively engaged, and some of us can't, then we need to disable and dismantle the systems that oppress. When we talk about structural racism, we also have to talk about white privilege. And we know already some of the ways in which white privilege works alongside racism in the statistics, which show things like the disproportionate number of Black and Asian and ethnic minority children excluded from school, the rates of incarceration of Black people, poorer access to health and mental health services, the rates of young Black and Asian people on remand in London, the fact that Black women are still 4 times more likely than white women to die in pregnancy or childbirth in the UK, that Black children are less likely to be encouraged to attain educationally, and that Black people are dying in disproportionate numbers in police custody. The list goes on. Now, Linda Olkoff, in her article, Whiteness, said that the core of white privilege is the ability to consume anything, anyone, anywhere. But still, whiteness likes to present itself as benign, even helping. Now, I want to mirror what James Baldwin said about the idea of white America being an outright lie, in saying that the same is the case for white England, which has fostered a state of willful blindness, involving not only a refusal to acknowledge that England was founded on the notions of white supremacy, but an interrelated insistence on the innocence of the white English at the same time. That's an interesting concept, innocence, when one thinks about the fact that Britain invaded 90% of the current 193 members of the United Nations by violent settler colonialism. So, social workers are used to working with the law, and the law is the structure that underpins Britain's self-construction as an enclosed space, within which resources and wealth obtained via colonial conquest belongs to Britons, conceived in large part as being white. Then the obstacles that are placed in the way of many migrants is a core technique of racial capitalism. The categorization of people into those with and those without rights of entry or stay sustains and reproduces colonial practices of racial ordering. So what I am interested in is the decolonization of the mind, a real interrogation of the meaning of whiteness, and looking at what decolonizing social work might look like. How do social workers practice social work in the interface of immigration law, for example, the state-sponsored hostile environment, or white privilege? But what do we mean by decolonizing or decolonization? There's no one meaning of decolonizing, and it's a contested term. But I understand it as the effort to interrogate and transform the institutional, structural, and epistemological legacies of colonialism. These legacies create injustices, including racialized attainment. Therefore, decolonizing also means looking at how our institutions function, how we conduct and explain our behaviors, our language, our practice, as well as examining how we engage with people. So how do we reconcile social work's position within this? Well, whiteness is in itself a performance of dominance. So how do we reconcile this with being a good social work professional? Donna Jeffrey, in her article about what is good anti-racist social work in Race, Ethnicity and Education journal in 2005, said that whiteness emerges as an organizing principle in social and cultural relations. The ideology of whiteness is characterized by its unmarked, universal, normal qualities and its links to innocence and goodness, unquote. So for white social workers, therefore, a critique of whiteness calls into question the identity of oneself as a good person, a good and altruistic helping professional. It also calls into question the unearned gains and privileges that whiteness brings. And faced with being the beneficiaries of white racism and yet terrified at the thought of being racist, white social workers live with a contradiction. So white social workers can often perform the PCFs, the professional capabilities framework of anti-racist and anti-discriminatory social work practice without actually having to critique our position as a beneficiary of the racist system. Therefore, social work practice often remains divorced from the systems and power relations at play. Social work frequently has to contend with law, and often immigration law, as we know. How then to conceptualize our work with British immigration law's role in a violent system of racial and colonial exclusion? How is this compatible with social work's stated values and ethics? And if it isn't, then what do we do about it? Nadine El Enani, in this book, which I hope you can see that, which is a brilliant read, called Bordering Britain, says that immigration law is racializing violence in itself. And I'm reminded of Ruth Wilson Gilmore's definition of racism in considering that inside Britain's borders, the racialized poor are differentially yet systematically vulnerable to being marginalized, controlled, policed, deported, and killed. British immigration law is part of the continuation of the colonial system, a colonial legal system that creates colonized subjects who are forced to engage in limited processes of legal recognition that tacitly reinforce the colonial state. So, to repeat, in concluding, what I'm interested in is how we go about the decolonization of the mind, how we go about a real interrogation of the meaning of whiteness, and how we go about decolonizing social work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Steve. Now, I'm delighted to invite Wayne, who is the main ticket this morning, to give his presentation. Thank you, Wayne.
Thank you very much. And just to say, that was a really powerful and perfect introduction, I feel, to my work. So thanks very much for that, Steve and Paul and Irene. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us this morning. I'll get straight to it because there's lots that I'd like to cover with you. I hope you can see my screen there and the presentation. So I'll begin. Just to say, it's not imperative that you take notes for this presentation. It will be available afterwards. So feel free to just kind of listen, hopefully, resonate with some of what I have to say, and we can share the presentation with you after this. The presentation does have interactive kind of web links. It is a kind of toolkit or training course to some degree that you will be able to look at in your own time. So feel free to just engage with that. And there will be questions and answer at the end. So I'd like to begin by saying that my perspective on anti-racism in social work is both personal and professional. Obviously, I'm a Black guy. There are very few Black male social workers also. So my perspective, I regard as a kind of minority perspective, but valuable all the same, equally valuable to everybody else's. My opinions do not represent all Black and ethnic minority people's opinions. We're not a homogenous group. I refuse to be the tokenistic Black voice of the organisation that I work for, which is the British Association of Social Workers, BASW, and one of many Black voices in social work. And I have to say my organisation has been very supportive of my work in this regard as well. I'm not an expert in organisational development or leadership. However, I am an expert with lived experience of personal and professional racism in life and in social work. So these are purely my opinions. And this presentation focuses on the experiences of Black and ethnic minority social workers, not service users. A large part of my work has focused on the workforce purely because I've discovered there's such a massive void there, I feel, in terms of support and protections and so on. I hope the images give some insight into the perspective that I bring in this presentation. So why was George Floyd's murder such a catalyst? George Floyd was murdered by a police officer and the world has seen the evidence. His murder was the latest in a long line of atrocities, brutalities and calamities endured by Black and other ethnic minority communities. This has a long history, longer than is sometimes convenient for honest acknowledgement. Some commentators refer to George's death, which is a dilution of what occurred. He was brutally murdered. Black Lives Matter is a global movement demanding for Black lives to be valued equally to white people's lives. There is a long and enduring history of this not being the case, a lot of which Steve spoke about earlier on and covered from a more global perspective. The retort of white or all lives matter in response to BLM is not comparable or even relevant. This is like asking what about colon cancer during a discussion about breast cancer, or advising a bereaved mother that all lives matter at her child's funeral. Save the whales does not mean other sea life is unimportant. White lives have always mattered, so to keep proclaiming white lives matter adds excessive value to them, tilting us further towards white supremacy. BLM has its critics, but it's unclear why a movement that promotes equality is demonized by some people who vehemently claim they are not a racist and advocate for freedom of speech. Now, I do think racism or being a racist is seen as a black and white issue, literally. A lot of people say I'm not a racist, but actually I think there's a spectrum there. It's a grey area, some of which I will explore in this presentation. This is an infographic that I've created on anti-Black racism from people without impulse and what that entails. I'm not going to cover all of these in great depth. Just to give you a flavor, as I said, the presentation will be available to you after this. I'll start with the first, which is an inability to listen to Black people's problems and respond with empathy. Another particularly pertinent one is conflating anti-Black racism with issues faced by people without colour. And the other is downplaying and or glossing over racism in the workplace and society. And again, I think that correlates with what Steve was saying earlier on around what's happening inside and outside of social work. Here is another infographic by an anti-racism pioneer called Gurnam Singh, who was an academic in social work. I'm not going to cover this infographic in huge amount of detail as well, but it outlines 4 different types of white identity, which I think is important to kind of conceptualize. The first being white supremacy, which of course we hear a lot about. If you're somebody like me, you experience a lot of. Then we have white indifference, white awareness, and white allyship. Now, there's lots of different indicators there under each one as to, what each of those will manifest itself like, and obviously they're not exhaustive lists. But I'd just like to focus on the very last point made in each column, which is with white supremacy, the onus is on Black people to accept their place. I think that's an interesting perspective to look at, especially through, some of the ideas that Steve introduced earlier on in terms of, how that will manifest itself in everyday life and in the workplace. White indifference, the onus is on Black people to build up their resilience. That has correlations with social work generally, I feel, in that the onus is put onto the workforce to be more resilient, as opposed to looking at the systems and structures that effectively oppress them. And in this case, even more so for Black people and people of colour, in that the emphasis is on us to be resilient in the face of white supremacy, essentially. Moving across, white awareness, you'll see that the onus is on white people to overcome unconscious bias, which I do think is a sort of a tool that is used to dilute a lot of discriminatory issues that people face, but I'll not dwell on that. Moving across to white allyship, the point there is about the onus being on white people to build sustained partnerships with Black people. And you'll see how the emphasis there for each identity is quite different, and the realities of it are even more different. moving on. What is anti-racism? Anti-racism is a belief that all races and ethnic groups are equal and deserving of the same opportunities. But the most important part of anti-racism is the next step, which is to do something about the existing inequality. Anti-racism is the active dismantling of systems, privileges, and everyday practices that reinforce and normalize the contemporary dimensions of white dominance. This, of course, also involves a critical understanding of the history of whiteness. And that's a definition from Ibram X. Kendi from his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, which I would recommend reading. Here is another infographic on becoming an anti-racist. Again, I'm not going to dwell on this infographic too long, but you will see that the starting point is the fear zone, which is essentially one aspect of white supremacy, moving through to the learning zone, and then through to the growth zone. Some comments that I've had or discussions I've had regarding this infographic is that becoming anti-racist is essentially an infinite concept. There is no endpoint. It involves continuous development, both personally and professionally. So that's one particular comment that I would have as a caveat with that infographic. But you'll see there are lots of different narratives in the different zones and the different stages that people arrive at in their development. How is anti-racism relevant to social work? Now, I'm not going to labor this slide either, other than to say that social work has a relationship with anti-racism through the professional standards, although that is explicit. You'll see there in the standards that I've listed, it does talk about recognizing difference across diverse communities. They do talk about challenging the impact of disadvantage, discrimination on people, etc., as well as promoting social justice. But there is no explicit mention of anti-racism, anti-discrimination, anti-oppression, and that's something that myself and BASW are looking to promote and lobby, and hopefully in the future iterations of the standards we can incorporate. Other areas in which anti-racism is relevant to social work are the BASW Code of Ethics. So my organisation is the host of the Code of Ethics through being the Professional Association for Social Work, and those are available on our website and via that link when you get this presentation. There are lots of other ways in which anti-racism intersects with social work through bedrock of social justice, in which social work is founded. I've talked about anti-oppressive, anti-discriminatory and anti-racist practice in terms of values and ethics. There's also position statements that my organisation has issued around George Floyd's murder and promoting anti-racism, both within our organisation, but also within the profession. There is an article there on confronting the white elephant, white privilege in social services, that I would strongly urge you to read when you get your copy of this presentation too. Similarly, cultural competence is a theory that has been around for a long, long time in social work, which relates to understanding the cultural differences of different communities and people from different social backgrounds. And of course, there is a kind of resurgence of decolonising education across the board, but also in social work. Professional capabilities. From this slide, I really just want to emphasise that Black and ethnic minority social workers cannot and should not be expected to fix racism in their workplace. However, those of us who are confident and capable enough with the right support can have a crucial role in educating, empowering and equipping ourselves and potential allies and influencers to enhance and shape anti-racism initiatives in our workplace settings. Everyone has a duty to combat racism and other forms of discrimination in the spaces they occupy. This includes racist incidents when they occur, forming like-minded alliances with peers to tackle key issues, raising awareness, and social justice activism. Here are a few examples of some of my involvement in anti-racism in social work and that of my organisation. You'll see the front cover of a book that I have collaborated on with Siobhan McLean recently. Shameless plug, I've got the book here, I'll show you that. I don't know if you can see that. So pretty excited about that, pretty boosted. And last year I spoke at the Guardian Social Lives event. I've co-founded a group at BASW, which is the Black and Ethnic Minority Professional Symposium. There's been a number of other sort of high profile events which I've spoken at, articles I've written and so on. And I don't mind throwing myself into it, if I'm honest, because for me, it's all about Black Lives Matter. I'm probably a bit obsessed. I think my wife would probably agree with that. But, you know, that's sort of my passion, really. So although, you know, it probably looks like I'm here, there and everywhere, possibly self-promoting, you know, I just want you to know it's really about Black Lives Matter for me. How much of a priority is anti-racism in social work, really? Anti-racism in social work must be fully considered and dismantled through collaboration with Black and ethnic minority social workers in roles as experts with personal and professional lived experience. This is the only way that Black and ethnic minority social workers' basic needs can be properly met and their wide-ranging expertise fully utilised. Of course, this approach can only improve the experiences of Black and ethnic minority service users too. It really is just a question of how much of a priority is anti-racism in social work. And that's the ongoing question for me. I think it's quite obvious who the realists and who the pretenders are when we talk about anti-racism in social work. There's a lot of rhetoric from some, and there's a lot of sort of action from the few, really. And, you know, I shamelessly have to say that I feel BASW, my organisation, has led the way with that. Great to hear from colleagues this morning about what's happening in Tavistock and Portman, of course, as well. And I'm really kind of enthused by that. And the work of others. I mean, there are other green shoots as well within the profession, but I have to say that there's been a real disappointing silence from some quarters. So we really need others to show up as well. Anti-racism, so what? Blah, blah, yawn. If the news of police officers taking selfies beside the bodies of 2 murdered Black sisters, the recent far-right violent protests in London, or the racist comments by Suffolk councillors do not outrage you or alert you to the fact that racism is thriving in this country right now, then you really must consider whether you have sleepwalked into being an opponent of anti-racism. At the very least, we must be self-aware and honest with ourselves and others when our boredom threshold is reached. Boredom can be subliminal and counterproductive to anti-racism at every level. Everyday microaggressions, including banter in the workplace, can fuel violent racist incidents. Barriers to meaningful organisational change. I think the picture speaks for itself, but I will read you this paragraph. Before any meaningful change can be achieved, social work educators and employers must acknowledge the inherent nature of whiteness, white fragility, white privilege, and white supremacy as unconscious bias in most, if not all, institutions, structures, and organizational cultures. Individual and organizational awareness is an imperative first step for social workers, employers, and educators to address workplace racism effectively. Forgive this wordy slide, but because there has been the sad passing of Sir William Macpherson recently, I did want to include this slide, which is from an article I wrote, so do bear with me. Social work is institutionally racist, but so are many institutions, organisations, and professions, not just the police, when you consider Sir William Macpherson's definition from the 1999 report of the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. There is evidently a collective failure to provide an appropriate and professional service to social workers of colour based on their colour, culture, or ethnic origin. This is visible in processes, attitudes, and behaviour which amount to discrimination through unwitting prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness, and racist stereotyping, which disadvantage people. This correlates with the overrepresentation of Black and ethnic minority social workers in fitness to practice cases. Reports from the Social Workers Union of Black social workers being failed on their assessed and supported year in employment, and various other detrimental career outcomes. I occasionally will liken that to the modern day example of lynching, for example, which in my mind it is wrecking people's careers based on barefaced racism, really. Many prominent social work leaders ask the same old tired questions, then promise another exploration of the long and grueling wilderness we meandered through in previous decades. Just like another government inquiry into, well, take your pick, the ongoing Windrush scandal, Stephen Lawrence, stop and search, the tactics generally deployed by our oppressors generally involve seek and destroy, smoke screens and mirrors, or deafening silence. We must now ask, is there really the appetite for real change? Is there the actual commitment, intention, and motivation? Because if not, why not? Financial investment is not necessarily a major hurdle here. It comes down to the priorities and values of the existing leadership. I'd rather have some meaningful action, even if it's not perfect, as long as it is genuine, rather than this never-ending paralysis of fear and/or indifference. Let's have more clarity about what your change looks like and the timescales for implementation. If not, this is all just performative window dressing and pitiful. No more questions, just actions, please. Here's another infographic. I'm not going to cover this in huge detail either, but I'll let you look at that, when you get your copy of this. But just to outline that the 4 dimensions of racism are structural, internalized, interpersonal, and institutional. You can't read yourself into activism. Anti-racism in social work risks being perceived as radical activism or anarchic ideology. Our social policy, practice, and education recognize this is a social construct with no validity, invented and refined principally to oppress Black people. Race remains an unstable concept because it superficially is based on physical appearance. When race was constructed, people knew very little about DNA, genetics, and human origins. It is an outdated colonial invention that still permeates modern society. Intellectually and morally, as a profession and as a society, we must see beyond what was predetermined for us centuries ago. So if society is built on plantations of racism, still celebrates racist history and traditions, and reminds us daily of the inescapability of white supremacy, it's not enough for social workers and social work organisations to be colourblind or non-racist. We must be proactively anti-racist. Otherwise, anything else is just tiresome lip service. If anti-racism in social work does not exist for social workers, can it ever truly exist for service users? Anti-racism is absolutely integral to social work, so when will it be given the credence it deserves? Without standing up for our defining values and ethics, what is to stop us succumbing to the pervasive and pernicious postmodern sleaze? And a colleague of mine, Dr. Muna Abdi, a leading anti-racism educator, states very clearly, the work of anti-racism is to fight racism wherever you see it, even in your... The struggle cannot be found in the pages of a book. You lead yourself into racism. Sooner or later, you'll have to make a decision. The Bane Conundrum. I'm not going to dwell on this one for too long. I think most people who know me will describe it as a clumsy, incoherent, opportune, category colour or not. Of course, I can't speak for all people of colour, and I understand that BAME can be operationally helpful when exploring the overarching effects of all things racist. However, it has so much nuance and subtlety that it can be seized upon by those who wish to deny racism as a white problem. Routinely, I hear people comfortably stating that BAME people can't even agree amongst themselves. This sloppy reductivism leads to terms being invented, such as black on black crime. I never hear about white on white crime, ever. Here's another infographic that I created, which showcases the 3 typical responses to anti-racism from social work organisations. And that's myself shooting at David De Gea of Man United, if only. So the first type of response is dismal, and that's me putting it way wide into the crowd. This involves noteworthy silences. Anti-racism is not discussed. There are no attempts to acknowledge or address racism. Leaders hope this Black Lives Matter stuff just blows over. The second action is where I hit the bar, or the stanchion, I believe it's called, where I fluffed it. And this involves cringe position statements and feeble blogs. Recycled statements from years ago are regurgitated, previous rhetoric on workforce unity with predictable platitudes, but no action. Unfortunately, this response is common. And third is the goal, if only. Authentic anti-racism action plans are published, outlining significant reforms that commit to specific, measurable, achievable, and realistic targets. I'm not going to cover this infographic in any great depth either, other than to introduce you to it. This is the anti-racist commitment framework, again, which I've sort of cobbled together. The main strands are around accelerating diversity within organizations, and I give some strategic ways in which you might do that. The next strand is around educating, empowering, and equipping the workforce. And again, there's some ideas as to how that might be done. Leading by example. So that's about senior leaders taking responsibility and taking on accountability. And finally, building transparency using data collection to be able to create a sort of identity dashboard, not just about race, but about all the protector characteristics that people have within the workplace, and ensuring they have the right support and protections for that. What needs to happen nationally? The existing national frameworks and initiatives to support social workers of colour are fragmented and optional. This creates confusion and dilution in their coherence and implementation in practice. Social work has a long history of committing to anti-discriminatory practice, but less in the way of practical mandatory implementation or robust challenge on these issues. Now is the time for social work leaders to step up and properly address this by meaningfully and purposefully moving this agenda forward by establishing a mandatory anti-discriminatory national framework is universal across social work. An important first step would be to explicitly reintroduce anti-discriminatory, anti-oppressive practices and anti-racist values and ethics into the professional and qualifying education and training standards. This should also involve partnership working between key stakeholders to enforce these values and ethics across the professional landscape. Key aims and objectives would be to ensure consistency, introduce mandatory requirements, emphasize anti-racist values, and be universally applicable to all social workers, like the Professional Capabilities Framework and the existing professional standards. We all know that organisations can sometimes be avoidant of anti-racism, but as social workers, we must recognise that silence or inaction on racism is complicity with the oppressors. Unfortunately, as a profession, we've been complacent, and we've got much more to do to cultivate equality, diversity, and inclusion in the workplace and in society. The next few slides are, I guess, quite idealistic from my point of view. They are around what an anti-racist working environment might look like, what can social work employers do to promote anti-racism in the workplace, what would the experience be like for Black and ethnic minority social workers, and so on. So the first is around recruitment, the first strand, and anti-racist recruitment targets are set to employ Black and ethnic minority senior leaders and educators to better reflect local communities and the workforce where necessary and possible. And by that, I mean, the demographics, obviously in different parts of the country are very different. So it's around the services reflecting those local communities better. Secondly, the Rooney Rule, which is adopted from American football. This involves at least one person of colour candidate being interviewed for each senior leader vacancy. It's a positive discrimination, essentially, we used to call it in the 90s. The workforce. Now, I'm not going to read all of these, but there's lots of ideas that I have around supporting and protecting the workforce. Just to give you a few examples. So the first being that anti-racism is explicitly promoted in mission and position statements. There's a good example there for when you get your copy of this presentation. Along with other forms of discrimination included in relevant policies and procedures, and it also forms part of employees' employment contracts to underline its importance. So people aren't just essentially signing up to a job description, they're also signing up to particular values and ethics around anti-discrimination and so on. Another example is provisions are developed for those who have experienced workplace trauma associated with racism and other types of discrimination. This includes peer-led support groups for members to reflect fully on their personal and professional experiences. So just a safe space to offload, really, and promote that humanity. The other example I'd like to share with you from this is safe and informal systems are introduced for social workers of colour. For example, discriminatory practices or constructive solutions are made anonymously in an honesty box to empower people of colour without fear of reprisals. Arising issues are then explored in supervision, team meetings, or with senior leaders if necessary. The next strand is around education. Anti-racist education is recognised as being at the heart of developing a more cultured and inclusive workforce and healthy workplace. Education providers decolonise social work training programmes with the input of Black and ethnic minority academics, social workers and service users integrated at all stages of programme development and delivery. Anti-discriminatory, anti-oppressive and anti-racist practice form a fundamental and mandatory requirement of social workers' professional development and registration. This includes a range of educational tools and training opportunities for different learning styles to ensure quality cultural diversity education is prioritised and valued. Staff continuously learn and better understand microaggressions, stereotypes, and how they can demonstrate anti-racist practice. And I have to say that this vision that I have around education doesn't involve online learning, which is ironic given this is how I'm delivering this. But post-pandemic, ideally, this is something that is seen as an integral part of the training program for organisations, for all staff. Finally, the expertise of specialist external trainers and consultants is instrumental in shaping effective anti-racist approaches, with no reliance on tokenistic online courses. I stole my own thunder there. And finally, there's some other education links there, which I would encourage you to have a look at when you get your copy of this presentation. The next strand is around allyship. Anti-racist allyship is understood by senior leaders, educators, and practitioners, all manifestations of educating, empowering, and equipping allies to actively support colleagues from marginalised and minority groups is common ways in which managers and staff can become allies or allies to support their Black and ethnic minorities. Social work employers and educators demonstrate they are willing to keep listening and learning from people of colour to instigate meaningful change. And that's the important thing, really, not this kind of rhetorical change, but actual meaningful change, which can be measured. Here's another infographic. Again, I'll not labour that, but just to give you the headlines, as it were. The 7 A's of authentic allyship are appetite, ask, accept, acknowledge, apologise, assume, and action. And the final strand in that reverse mentoring and leadership programs. So firstly, workers to mentor senior leaders on basis needs, and that's just like it is important towards consider confidentiality opportunities are available, designed by different culture to progress cycles, provide potential. Programs are in place. This addresses the lack of Black and ethnic minority social workers in senior roles and provides support for those who are. And that's the last slide from me. Thank you very much for listening. And
thank you so much to Wayne and to the TAVI speakers as well. And I'm just choosing a very small part of your wonderful presentation, Wayne, but I wanted to ask you, did you mean us to give equal emphasis to the words tokenistic and online, and could you say a bit more about that? I mean, especially if you're emphasizing perhaps the limitations of online presentations.
yes, I can. So what I mean by that is that I think that there has been an over-reliance to some degree on online learning anyway, prior to COVID. Obviously now it's a necessity, and I understand that. Fingers crossed, there's light at the end of the tunnel and we can get back to some sort of normality. And when that occurs, I think there should be less reliance on online courses at that point generally anyway, but specifically in terms of work of this nature, anti-racism, anti-oppression, and anti-discriminatory practice, I feel that it needs more substantial kind of resources provided for it, and that might involve external speakers, for example, as I alluded to in the presentation. So there needs to be this move away from cutting corners. That's the point I was trying to make.
You've got it. Thank you.
We have a question from Karen Gupta. Karen, I don't know if you'd like to speak to it.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I had to pop out halfway through, so I'm looking forward to the slides later. My question was about the sort of whiteness in social work education. So the academics, the lecturers, a lot of, the education within the profession remains very white, and anti-racist social work is almost an afterthought, and sometimes just a a keyword thrown in, like you have to be anti-oppressive, you have to be anti-discriminatory, anti-racist, and things like that.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering what can be done to actually enforce change, rather than years and years of a lot of talk and a lot of networks and action plans, but actually implementing real change.
Okay. First thing is to say that, action plans, I think, are a key part of that, which you've touched on. But those in of themselves, I think we know, can just be an opportunity to kick this into the long grass. So they have to be action plans that are smart, which I think is what, I included in the presentation there, around them being specific, measurable, and, those different points that I made. So I think it's important that they are meaningful, and that has to begin with the values and ethics of the leadership in practice and in education and in policy, and that kind of those kind of values and ethics will then kind of translate into more meaningful kind of policies around, around legislation, around academia, around standards in practice, all those different things. So, in answer to your question around education specifically, I think it does begin with action plans, robust action plans. But I think there also has to be a kind of self-discovery journey of the leadership to some degree around where they're at in terms of some of the concepts that I talked about in the presentation in terms of anti-racism and so on. So I hope that helps in terms of my answer, probably a broad answer.
Okay, there's lots of questions in the chat, and I know a couple of people have got their hands up, so I'm going to try my best to get through them. Francis, you had a question. Would you like to ask it in person?
Possibly
No.
on mute.
Okay, I will ask Francis's question.
I think it's the wrong Francis that they unmuted.
I don't have a surname in the chat, so I don't know. I don't know which Francis. The question is, in terms of the microaggressions in the workplace and banter, how would you approach this? Is it largely to do with educating people? I think, but how to notice it and what to do. I'm currently a first year social work student and was curious.
Yeah, I would think that, yes, that question kind of answers itself. I think a large part of it is education. I think it is around educating the workforce, around educating both Black and ethnic minority social workers, but also white colleagues, and encouraging those kind of workplace relationships which are conducive to resolving situations, as opposed to it being a us and them divide, which I think it can be in some places. So yeah, I think a large part of it is education. Some of it is also, I think, to do with policies and procedures. Sometimes they can be years old, decades old. Some of them have kind of got outdated terminology in, as well as outdated kind of concepts or positions on certain things. So I think, policies and procedures need to be updated. They need to be clear, and they also need to be sort of reviewed periodically, including people who are going to be on the receiving end of that, including, Black and ethnic minority people. So there's a range of things there, I think.
Thank you, Wayne. I'm aware that there are a few people with their hand up. I'm just going to invite Dwayne Phillips, who's put in quite a long comment and question in the chat. Dwayne, would you like to speak to that?
Thank you firstly for today. A lot of kind of what I listened to today really resonates with some of the tenets of critical race theory, especially with like the majority voice silencing the voiceless. And I think you've seen it a lot just in the last 7 days with asking if Jews counted as an ethnicity, and even like an all-white panel discussing racism in relation to Meghan Markle. So when the kind of Minister of Equalities declares critical race theory is a dangerous trend, and the government stand unequivocally against this, how can we teach this at all levels and not just at the academic and professional levels?
I think we can do that as a profession. Thank you for your question, firstly, Dwayne, and nice to meet you because we've connected on social media, but first time we've actually
Yes, we have.
spoken. I think that as a profession, we need to take a firm stance in terms of our values and ethics, which, to my knowledge, are specific to social work and not influenced by any political party. So, if we reinvigorate some of the values and ethics I talked about in my presentation, I think that's social work staying true to itself as a profession. With regards to what you said about critical race theory and so on, I mean, I'm an advocate of critical race theory, I would say, first and foremost, but I'm also an advocate of many other relevant theories as well. So I'm also aware that people in positions of power politically, as I've written, for those of you who've read some of my stuff, I'm very aware that there's people in positions of power, particularly politics, who I would regard as gatekeepers, who effectively espouse white supremacy, which is far more palatable coming from a person of colour's mouth than it is coming from a white person in that particular forum. So, when particular people say things like that, I think it has to bounce off the armor, really, for people like me. And I think we have to push on regardless. They don't speak for me. They don't speak for the majority, I don't think. So they're part of the battle that, we need to engage in. So again, that's probably a broad answer, but hopefully I hope I've covered the salient points.
Thank you, Wayne. Most of the questions seem to be for you, but I might be misinterpreting, and we can also chip in as well. Shaminda has asked a question in the chat and has her hand up, so I'm going to go to Shaminda next.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you to all the panel, and Wayne, each time I see your presentation, I get more and more from it, so that's brilliant.
Thank you,
and one of the things that I'm really intrigued about, I've worked for the local authority for a number of years. I'm a social worker by background, and I've got the lovely adopted title of Race Equality Lead in Coventry. It's a little bit of an add-on to my full-time role, but I'm really excited about the fact that I'm due to join Ipswich Council in June to take on a lead role as race equality champion in their new management team, because of some of the reasons that we've discussed today. And I think, just looking at it a little bit sort of solution focused, I've learned so much from all of these presentations. Like Wayne, I've been on a journey for somewhat of probably 2 decades now. Can we come together in some forum and are we already doing this? And maybe I've missed it, but just to come together to collectively learn from each other and move things forward. Because Wayne's spoken about BASW, I'm sort of leading on a couple of things in the local authority, and in the chat I've noticed lots of people saying actually this is going on in our organisation. So across the board, whether it's business, sports, local authority, education, how can we identify a group where we have that safe space to learn from each other? We don't need to sort of reinvent the wheel, but actually I think it's going to we're going to get to hopefully the end result much quicker, having these conversations and collaborating with each other. So that's a question to anyone on the panel, but that's just my thought.
Yeah. I'm happy to speak, Paul. I don't know if you wanted to come in there.
Okay, you start, Wayne.
Yeah, I mean, for me, thank you for your question, Shaminda. I think it has to be about the motivation, intention, and commitment that I talked about in the presentation to begin with, from the senior leadership, but also from the workforce generally. There has to be the right systems and opportunities in place, I think, for people to want to learn and to be able to learn as well. In terms of the groups that you talked about, I think realistically, a place that I would like to get to personally is where there are different groups throughout the country that operate locally or regionally, and then they're able to intersect nationally, potentially through BASW, potentially through the Black and Ethnic Minority Professional Symposium, which I talked about, which I founded for BASW, you know, that's the kind of area I would like to get to, where we have pockets of little groups across the country. Because otherwise, I think it just becomes too cumbersome in terms of organising things. And we need to have that local, regional kind of perspective as well. So to be able to get that and to be able to feed into a national body like BASW, I think would be pretty great. So just final point as well. One of the things I'm looking at working on is, as we approach the anniversary of George Floyd's murder, I am going to be approaching the social work profession and the sector to see or evaluate rather what activities have been happening over the last 12 months. So I've not been looking at the chat, so sorry if I've been a bit ignorant there, but if people have been doing lots of things, I'd be really keen to hear about that. Do get in touch with me, because I would like to collate and get a picture of what's been happening over the last 12 months to kind of reflect that back to the profession and say, this is where we are and this is where perhaps we could get to.
Absolutely.
So that's it from me. Yeah.
Thank you, Wayne. And what's been happening and actually what's not is equally important, I think. But yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just to say, Wayne, we'll save everything in the chat so that you can see it afterwards. So I'm just going to call out a few people so that you know that I've got you in mind. So Inga, then Sharon Bond, Anne Simon, and then I'm going to come to Bankole and Sharon Kroon. And hopefully we're going to have time to let you all say what you want to say. So Inga first, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Wayne, for a wonderful presentation with such very inspiring infographics. I'm a psychologist and a psychotherapist, and I'm an immigrant here in Ireland. And when I first came to this country, it was a very homogeneous society, where in the census, 95% of the people said they were born in Ireland, they were Irish, and 97% they said they were Roman Catholic. Things have changed, also part of being in the EU and an exchange between young people studying elsewhere and coming back. But still, we are very white.
Okay.
I mean, Cork, because it's a university town, has always had more of a pluralistic feel about it. But how do you educate people when there's such a predominant kind of population is of one particular color and religion?
Okay. To be honest, I don't think it matters where somebody is in terms of their understanding of race relations. There just has to be a willingness on some level, on some part, for them to think, well, I recognize that how I've seen the world up to now isn't actually how it is, or what I've been taught, I recognize I need to unlearn, and I'm willing to kind of do that personally and or professionally, and I will engage in the work to do that. So the scenario you just described, or the circumstances you've just described, I think it's about the education being pitched at the right level for that demographic area, and for there to be a kind of interest on some level that people who are delivering the training, as it were, can connect with people and make it relevant and accessible to them. And as long as it's done on that basis, and it's done in a sort of authentic way, then I would like to think that you can usually bring people with you to some degree. You might not bring everybody with you, but you can bring, most right-minded people together, in my experience.
Yes, there has been a bit of organization, particularly because our immigration laws are also very repressive. So there's been activity on that forum, but not much else.
Yeah, like I say, I think it works both ways, both personally and professionally. So there's something organizations, need to be doing, whatever organization that is, whether it's a social work one or an allied profession or completely unrelated in business, perhaps. There just has to be that willingness at that sort of organizational level, but then at that interpersonal level as well. That's my take.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Wayne and Inga. I'm going to invite Sharon Bond to ask her question. Sorry, it's taken a while to get to you, Sharon. You're on mute.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I really wanted to thank you, Wayne.
Thank
you
you.
talked me through my life as a professional.
Right.
And as you were talking, I was remembering I trained as a social worker way back in the 70s, early 80s.
Mm.
And I remember getting a job under the title GOQ, people might forget.
Right.
Genuine occupational qualification for being Black, and going into a CAMS setting.
Yeah.
And I think what you talked about, the interpersonal relationships, how important they are, because having got the job, there's still all the, do you recognize me as your manager?
Yeah.
There's all the interpersonal relationships and the allies that you have to create around you, and notice how the allies also get, they get targeted as well. So I'm thinking there's the structure and there might be the wish to change, but to keep in mind those interpersonal relationships that actually make the difference. So I was really pleased that you spoke it. As I said, I was going through it. What it did do for me, which was really helpful, was that it made me very clear about who I wanted to be and what I wanted to do.
Right.
And so now I'm a family therapist.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
So I can't call myself a social worker because I'm not registered, but I still work with social workers.
Yeah.
I'm now a family therapist, and have set up training for family therapists who want to think, or people, social workers, psychologists, whoever, who want to think systemically and who want to look at relationships in context.
I see.
Because I don't think we can do all one. I like what you said about you start where you are, with who you are, and you work from that. So thank you very much. It's been very encouraging.
Good. I'm glad you got something from it. And thanks for sharing that. I've learned something there. GOQ, I didn't know about that.
Thank you, Sharon. I'm going to invite Anne Simon to ask her question. Are you still with us, Anne?
Hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah,
Hi
thank
there.
you for the presentation. I've obviously put bits in the chats that you've seen. My overarching concern is about language, and we all know about how powerful language is and the words that are used, how they are used and when they are used. You know, if we look back historically around all that you're addressing today, there is emphasis on words. And I feel that until we begin to alter, change, remove completely the use of terms that are coined by others on and imposed on others, such as me. I am a Black professional myself, never used it. I identify as a Black woman because that is who I am. And I'm also feeling strongly that until we removed words like BAME and what that implies, we are continually retaining a power struggle around who holds power and why this power remains in place. So that really is the emphasis that I'm trying to address, is around language, words, and the implication and how that retains the status quo about power, privilege, and position held in society, in the world, and in organisations. Yeah.
Thank you, Anne. Irene, I wondered if you'd like to comment on that, just to give Wayne a break.
Yeah, I think Wayne deserves a break.
I agree.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think quite a few people were asking for Steve's comments on this as well. So
yes, I'd love to hear from Steve. I'll unmute myself now, though.
Thank you, Anne. So
yeah.
Irene, then Steve.
I do feel that.
Sorry, Irene, did you want to go first?
Carry on, Steve.
Sure. Yeah, I couldn't agree more about language. I think it's we still really haven't addressed this enough, really, in terms of, you know, how language suppresses resistance. It dilutes resistance as well as creating words which oppress. Ngugi wa Thiong talks about this in some of his books. Actually, one of his books is called Decolonisation of the Mind, and he talks about that in his book about, as an African writer, he was taught at school to write in English, and he felt as he grew up that he couldn't do this. He couldn't express his feelings, his culture, his thoughts, his ideas, his anger in English. He couldn't do it. He didn't have the means to do it. And that was a way in which the colonialization of the mind acts internally. It creates new structures for saying things in a white way. And of course, then there's a suppression of the anger at, or the words that can be used to describe an anti-racist stance or an anti-colonialist stance. So I think it's incredibly important.
Thank you, Steve. Irene.
Yeah, just to add, I think really that term BAME has become a real problem. Labelling in general is a real problem. For our Race Equality Network, we actually voted that we didn't want to be titled the BAME Network, because very rarely do you hear of a board meeting being referred to as the white men's meeting. So we wanted our title to talk about what we did rather than who we were. So I just think language is just vitally important, and we need to get it right. Thanks, Paul.
Okay, I'm aware that we are running out of time and there are so many questions. So I'm going to ask Bankole to come in.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Wayne, for the presentation and the panel. Really enjoyed it. And, you know, thank you to the Tavistock. This is the second time during lockdown that I've been able to be a part of an event that they've put on. So I'm really grateful. And I'm training to be a psychotherapist. So, you know, very similar. And funnily enough, I was really taking umbrage with the term BAME as well. And you've addressed it and other people have spoken about it. And just, you know, just want to articulate a little bit. I just think it's really important, you know, specifically as Black people, that our journey is seen and heard, you know, and when we talk about, you know, transgenerational trauma that we've suffered, you know, there are other cultures that have suffered differently, but they haven't suffered that, you know, and I think about, you know, the example of the Jewish community being able to separate themselves. They've got specific words for racism. You know, and I think as Black people, those are the types of things that we need to be working towards, you know, and when I looked very briefly at the Tavistock, you know, board of governors, they're 3 Asians and a Black person. And if you use the term BAME, it could look like, you know, all of a sudden the Tavistock is a multicultural board, and that's not the case. You know, we are very, very different, you know. And I don't even think, and taking it just a little step further, a little bit controversial, Blacks and Asians don't even have the greatest relationship. You know, there are a lot of Asian peoples who wouldn't necessarily love a Black person to be involved in their family. So clumping us all together, and that's, you know, that's not against Asian people. I'm just making the point that because we're considered minorities, we're not actually all together. So clumping us all together is really, really unfair. You know, we need to be separated. And just lastly, on the topic of racism, I'm a little bit like, I think we're fighting a losing battle here. You know, when I think about places like football stadiums, you know, that they can't even resolve it at football stadiums, where if somebody is racist, you know, for me, an easy solution is you're banned for life, you're fined, the club is fined. I mean, real harsh, you know, penalties. If you can't even, somebody like Ian Wright, I don't support Arsenal, you know, who is considered a footballing god, if he can be if somebody can be racist towards him and they can't resolve it other than a slap on the wrist, then it's not going to trickle down to organizations in the playground and everywhere. It's going to be acceptable. You know, there are no harsh penalties, you know, and so for me, language is really important, and separating all of us, clumping them all together is like someone else said, you know, we're just compounding the problem. So yeah, thank you for your presentation, Wayne. You know, I heard your personality in there. I really appreciate it. So yeah.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Really
Thank
good
you,
points, well
Bankole.
made as well.
Yeah, and very relevant. I saw in the news this morning the Premier League being held to account about their inaction to deal with racism. And great that you could join us again for your second lockdown Tavistock session. And I've just seen in the chat, we've got somebody joining us from Australia, so you're really welcome. And it's great that we can attract people from all around the world. Sharon Kroon, you've been waiting really patiently. I'm sorry it's taken so long to get to you, but over to you.
No, that's okay. I just wanted to again extend my thanks. I'm actually in Edinburgh, and I'm a teacher, so I'm sneaking away from my online life at the moment. And I've particularly come just because I've been interested in anti-racism. We're also in the middle of a huge report that's just been published around allegations of racism within schools in Edinburgh, and I actually teach in one of these schools, and so taking forward this agenda about decolonising and the kind of terms we use is particularly relevant. But something I did notice, and I think is really important when we work for these types of public sector organisations that have a duty of care to other people, is to make sure, especially now, I think it's highlighted, is the failure of these institutions to act as the model of good practice for the philosophy or underpinning that they come from. So if we're talking about education, we have to be in organizations that nurture us as individuals so that we can then nurture our service users, our pupils, our parents. And part of our journey that we're looking at is reframing our practice from a nurture perspective. And then if you look at the nurture that you're providing for people and human beings, you get back in touch with your humanity. Because so often we've talked about the fact that this kind of factory model of education, where we don't appreciate that people come in all kinds of shapes and sizes, but we have this endpoint that we want to get to, which is standardization or delivering a standard practice. We have to all clump together and say that there are dehumanizing aspects of this organization. And if we are allowed to call them out and look at them, you will probably find that rather than the racism being the thing, there is this dehumanizing that's happening on such a broad level that racism can sit quite neatly within some of these other structures. And I think that's something that if we're talking about on a national level, the government is kind of saying, well, we don't agree with the critical race theory, then give us some other working theories that we can build collective sense around, which is what we're trying to do as humans. And that is a galvanizing force for every public sector worker. What are the underlying principles and humanizing processes that allow us to be human and extend our humanity to the people that we are there to serve? And that's what I just wanted to add my little bit to.
And how well articulated and with such passion, Sharon. Thank you very much. Completely agree. I'm just going to give time for, we are about to run out of time, but I'm going to invite Mawahib to ask his question. I think he's put at least one question in the chat. And I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Mawahib. Are you still with us? Maybe not. Okay, in that case, I'm going to give the last comment or question to Sonny, who's had her virtual hand up for a long time. Sonny, are you still with us?
Yes.
Great.
Yeah, sorry, it wouldn't let me unmute. I'm a he, by the way, not a she, but that's all good.
Sorry.
That's all right, don't worry. It happens a lot. Just to clarify, I think I wrote a comment in the chat. Basically, it feels as if the whole system is engineered, and that is the key word I'm using. Engineered. It's not natural. It's engineered to emphasize another perspective, the perspective of those who are oppressing, not those who are wishing to no longer be oppressed. And if you look at it in terms of how the government is endorsing very strong narratives and agendas, I will just say that. I'm not going to say much further on that. But they're also supporting countries around the world who have supremacist agendas, whether that be Hindu supremacists in India, whether that be white supremacists in America. At the time, obviously, I know they've just changed president, but it's still there, obviously, as we're all aware. Race inequality didn't just occur in America in the last 4 years, it's been several hundred years. And is it just that we're just constantly fighting this upward battle? And then, as you said, then they throw in, oh, we'll put you all as, it was originally BME, wasn't it? And now BAME. Again, as an Indian, Punjabi, I don't really wish to be identified as Asian, because if you put me in a box as Asian, that's half the world's population, give or take, is Asian. So it's just the constant othering of us, or othering of everyone. Like, we're all being put into these little man-made boxes to fit the agenda of those who have been domineering over us for generations. And by putting us in this box, you're not identifying the specific needs of each individual community. Because if you put even the B, black, how many cultures and communities are there within that one box? Hundreds, thousands, whole civilizations, but we're being identified by these boxes. And I just don't agree with the whole box culture that exists. To be perfectly honest, that's I'm off my soapbox now, sorry.
Thank you, Sonny. Do any of our panel members want a very quick response to that? Because I'm going to also invite Mawahib in as well, just before we finish.
Yeah, I mean, I think the language and terminology, as we have already said, is really important. But I was really struck in the terminology that I try and use by Sivanandan. He was in the Institute of Race Relations until he died. A great thinker and activist. He deliberately used the word black as a generic term because it offered a way for a spectrum of communities and groups to collectivize politically around a shared experience of marginalization, dehumanization, racism. I was really struck by that. And that, when I say the word black, that's what I mean. And it is interesting in using the word language, how there's some sort of these collectivizing terms that do disempower, that do disenfranchise, that do marginalize and ignore. And there are other collective terms like Sivanandan's used that can be used hard and politically to make a point. And I think the important thing is when you do use the terms that I explain them, I suppose, what I mean by that. So that would be my view.
Thank you, Steve. So, Mawahib, I'm going to invite you in for the last question, and I've asked you to try and be brief, please, because we're over time.
Yes, thank you so much. So my question's for Wayne. I'm a newly qualified social worker, and I'm just, working in this current environment where there's a lot of discussions held about anti-racist practice. And I've felt that for myself, it's been quite an emotional ride, and traumatic at times, especially when, you want to have these conversations and you want to push forth, this change, but it does have, a very real impact on, Black workers. I wanted to ask you, as someone who is, so passionate about anti-racist practice, how do you keep going? And what advice would you have for people like myself who, are really struggling at the moment? Right. And how do we keep that momentum going? Thank you.
Do you mean sort of how you keep it going personally, individually, or do you mean collectively as part of the movement? Sorry.
I think collectively as part of a movement, and especially within the workplace.
Oh, right. Okay.
Thank you.
I think how we keep it going collectively, as anti-racist social workers and allies is that we continue to campaign in the same way that we have, but also to ramp that up as well. And I think that we need to do that at different levels. I think we need to do it at the interpersonal level, which I talked about in the presentation. We need to do that in the sort of workplace. So I think I talked about like-minded individuals forming alliances and so on. You know, I think it's important that we group together, we mobilize and we strategize. And we do that dependent on our local environment and the demographics, and you know, and we look to do it, I guess, in a kind of authentic way that's true to ourselves, that's true to our workplaces and our colleagues, and that's true to social work and the values and ethics that I talked about. And in terms of, I guess, on a personal level, how I keep going and stuff like that, I suppose that everybody has their own different ways, I suppose, of what you know keeps them going. What keeps me going is keeping active. That keeps my mental agility quite active. So I would encourage anyone who is involved in this work to look after yourself in whatever way appeals to you. But I think it's also important to remember that, you know, mind and body, it's intrinsically linked. So, you know, being consumed in this stuff sometimes, all the time, it's not healthy. So you'd have to step away in whatever way feels right for you. So I think that's important to kind of keep in mind as well. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Mawahib. That's a really great question and a good question to end on. And thank you, Wayne, for answering. So it falls to me to say the final few words, and I'll keep it brief because we've gone over time, so apologies for that. But I feel like we could have gone on for another 2 hours and we would still be having a really rich discussion. So I just want to thank the panel, to Irene and Steve, my Tavistock colleagues, to Gazelle, who arranged the event and has done some behind the scenes work, and I'm sure we'll carry on doing behind the scenes work in terms of the recording of today and the chat. And most of all to Wayne, who I've only known for a short while, but so great to hear you speak as always, Wayne. Thank you for coming and sharing your time, your thoughts, your passion, your resources, everything with us. I feel like you've really treated us on this Friday morning. And thank you to the 270 something people that have tuned in at some point today. I'm really sorry that quite a few of you had questions or comments to ask or say, and you didn't get the chance to do so. I failed in my aim to try and get everybody to speak, but there were just so many questions and comments, it was just impossible in the time that we had. So apologies for that from me. However, this is not a one-off event. This is going to be, we hope, one of many. And if you have ideas about events that you would like us to put on at the Tavistock, or about an event you would like to be part of with us, then please do get in touch with Gazelle or with me. We'd be really pleased to hear from you. And I just want to say one final thing. Those of you who are social workers, or not even social workers, but on Twitter, you might be aware of a anti-racist social work campaign that I'm involved with, Wayne is involved with, and a few other social workers from across the country and some social work students. And we are coordinating a day of personal and collective action to coincide with the United Nations International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination on the 19th of March. And I'm just about to post into the chat some more details about that. If you would like to take part and join us for that direct action, we would love you to get involved. You can access a webinar next Tuesday. You can look at a YouTube video, or there's a landing page which gives you details about the campaign. And we are encouraging social workers, but of course, it can be anybody, it doesn't have to be just social workers, to pledge to commit to taking personal action and collective action on the day of the 19th. So please follow us on Twitter, please retweet and like our tweets. We want to spread the word and you know, make this a really impactful campaign. So really good that you could join us today. Thank you very much for coming. We hope to see you again, and have a great weekend.